Origins of Modern Liberalism, Progressive Political Science, Lecture 1. In this lecture, we move from the philosophical sources of progressivism to a discussion of a particular chapter from a book by a political scientist by the name of Charles Merriam. He was a political scientist, late 19th century, early 20th century. I believe he also at times worked as an advisor to the government, I think maybe during the New Deal era. Uh, so, so Charles Merriam, in the book that this chapter called Recent Tendencies is taken from, is actually a book that he published right around the turn of the 20th century. It's called The History of American Political Theories. And this was a book where he sort of chapter by chapter gave a summary of the main schools of, I guess we would say, political philosophy or political thought that had existed in the United States since from the colonial era up until his present. And this chapter, Recent Tendencies, is the final chapter of the book, where he is talking about the transformations that have occurred, especially among the intellectuals, especially among the elites in the late 19th century, and which was already at his time, around the turn of the century, and definitely by a decade later, was recognized that what he was talking about really is sort of the formation of the progressive school of thought and what later becomes the liberal school of thought in America. And there were a series of reform movements that challenged the founding principles in various ways, that called for various kinds of reforms, some of which were wholly or partially successful, other ones were not. But before getting to the Merriam chapter, which is really about the kind of the intellectual changes, the philosophical changes that took place in the 19th century among the intellectual elite, I wanted to say something about the way that progressive reform occurred in the United States, because there were really kind of three big waves of reform, and they overlap and are connected enough that you can see them as kind of three waves of one general tendency or general movement. That's why I kind of can group them together under the name of liberal or progressive. But nonetheless, these three waves are also distinct enough from one another that it's useful to characterize them separately so that you can see how the progressive way of thinking about politics evolved over time in the United States. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of this lecture actually talking about those three waves and the first wave before getting to the material in the Merriam chapter, which I will talk about primarily in lectures 2 and 3 on this reading. So, as I said, there were kind of three waves of progressive reform. The first one, and now these, I'm not a professional historian, so the date ranges that I'm supplying here are ones that I, kind of made up. You'll get different historians that will divide things up into periods in different ways. My goal here is just to give you something basic enough so that you can kind of grasp the general development. And so the first wave of progressive reform, really begins after Reconstruction. So it's kind of especially the 1880s, especially in a number of localities, a number of major U.S. cities. And this wave, it begins in the 1880s and lasts right up through about 1920, with somewhere around 1920. And this is the period of reform that comes to be associated with the capital P progressive movement. As you might know, oftentimes people who are on the left or who are liberal in America today will refer to themselves as progressive with a lowercase p. They used to be, the term was liberal for a while, but now progressive is the term that is most often used by those who identify to the left of center, you could say, in American politics. The capital P progressives were an actual political party that lasted for a period of time in the early 20th century. So that's why you have a capital P with them, because it's actually naming not a general tendency or a political ideology, but an actual political party, an actual sort of coalition of groups that called themselves progressives. And the progressive movement really gets started around the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900 or so. Now, this first wave from the 1880s to around 1920, which you can call the progressive era loosely, is especially associated with the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was president, basically from early 1913 through 1920. Woodrow Wilson was not the first progressive president, though. The first president to identify as a progressive was really Theodore Roosevelt, who was the president prior to Woodrow Wilson in the 1900s for much of them. And he was in the Republican Party, Theodore Roosevelt was. And then after he stepped down, after he stepped down from the presidency, when he decided to run again in 1912, he actually ran as the candidate for the Progressive Party. So the first wave of progressive reform, kind of the big names are Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. And in some ways, you could say that Woodrow Wilson is the one that was responsible for progressivism in America finding its home in the Democratic Party. Sort of prior to Woodrow Wilson, there were progressive factions both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. And in some ways, it depended upon what part of the country you were in. Whether it was the Republicans or the Democrats that were more progressive. But really, progressivism begins to find its sort of permanent home in the Democratic Party, and that's one of the main reasons why the Democratic Party now, is the center-left party in American politics. So, the second wave comes in the 1930s, in the wake of the stock market crash in 1929, and then the Great Depression in the early 30s. Because after World War I, the progressive movement kind of fragments. And part of this was actually, you could say, because of Wilson, that there was a big division within the progressive movement and the groups that made up the progressive movement. There was a big division within them about whether or not the United States should become involved in World War I. And this is a debate you still see today. Should we try to help other countries? And intervene even if our national security is not at stake in order to push a kind of progressive international agenda? Or should we focus on the problems we have at home and not get involved in foreign wars that are not directly our business? And you heard that kind of debate around the Iraq War and other times. So something like that happened with World War I. And so when Wilson decided to take the United States into World War I, it began to cause real tensions within the progressive movement. And so by the end of the Wilson presidency, things were a little bit in disarray. And so you get the 1920s with a string of Republican presidents where the kind of ambitious reforms being pushed by the progressive movement kind of take a back seat. But then the stock market crash in 1929 and then the subsequent Great Depression a little while later provided a catalyst, you could say, for another wave of progressive reform. And really, this era, like 1933 through, you could say probably 1945 or so, this corresponds with the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And the name that he gave for his policy proposals or for his agenda was the New Deal. So the 1930s are kind of remembered as the New Deal era. And the second era of the New Deal is the one that had a very significant effect on the federal government. That although there were a number of changes that took place during the progressive era, it's really the New Deal when you begin to have some serious institutional and policy transformations at the federal level, especially including an expansion of the powers of the institution of the president and the White House, but also the building of a federal welfare state as a part of the New Deal agenda. The New Deal, to a certain extent, is gets not exactly cut off, but the priority of these domestic reforms of the New Deal begin to take a back seat to what becomes World War II by the late 30s and then in the early 40s, when the United States finds itself embroiled in a massive global war against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. So there's a shift towards foreign policy there. Harry Truman succeeds Roosevelt when Roosevelt dies, but and continues basically kind of a New Deal platform. But really, in the late 40s and then in the 50s, at the federal level, you don't see a lot of major further changes or reforms. And so, in the same way that the 20s were kind of a period of quiet after the Progressive era, the 50s were kind of a period of quiet after the New Deal era. Although, in one sense, that's really not true. And this is what gets us to the third wave of reform. So, although the 50s are generally known as a time of kind of political quiescence and conformity, the Eisenhower Leave It to Beaver years and all that kind of stuff, you did have some major political changes happening then, and the most consequential of which I think was clearly the civil rights movement, which was getting started in the Jim Crow South during this time. And so, that civil rights movement itself was one of the major contributors to the next wave of progressive or liberal reform, which I think really begins in, say, 1964 or so, with the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, obviously, John F. Kennedy had been president for 3 years, but he had policy, platforms and all that kind of stuff. But it's really Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society programs that gives a big push to a new wave of various progressive reforms that incorporate some things from the New Deal, but also this is the era when you begin to get some major federal environmental policy. It's when you get the war on poverty. You get the beginnings of federal anti-discrimination policy in Title IX, so discrimination on the basis of race, on the basis of sex. By the late 60s, you have the emergence of the gay rights movement. So there are a lot of kind of social movements and political changes, policy changes going on in the 1960s. And they really, in some ways, continue into the 70s, even though in 1968, Richard Nixon is elected president. And so you have Republican presidents for a while. But nonetheless, Congress remains dominated in both the House and the Senate by the Democratic Party. So even when you have a Republican president after the 1968 election, you still have a lot of liberal reform coming out of Congress. So I don't really know what a good cutoff date is for that one. I mean, Lyndon Johnson is president through January of 1969. But you could say the 1960s through the mid 1970s or so. And beginning in the late 70s, even though you have Carter as president, you're beginning to have the growth of the modern conservative movement. And that, along with other things, kind of puts a brake on some of the more ambitious reforms of the 60s and 70s. Now, things have happened since then, but one of the major ones, obviously, being the Affordable Care Act back in 2009, 2010. But really, the big three waves are the kind of the 1880s to about 1920, and that's the progressive era. The 1930s into the mid 1940s, that's the New Deal era. And then, the mid 1960s and mid 1970s or so, which is the Great Society era. Now, let me say a few things about the progressive era before I end this lecture. So the progressives, they really get started in the late 1800s. I had you read Charles Merriam, and this chapter, Recent Tendencies, is his summary of the kind of the thought of progressive political scientists around the turn of the century. So it's not representing simply his own view, but also the view of a lot of his peers, including one peer that he refers to briefly as Wilson, which is, of course, Woodrow Wilson, but this was written before Woodrow Wilson was president. The progressive kind of revolution, or the progressive movement in the United States, really has two kind of important elements, or two important causes, two things that contribute to it. There is a change in social and economic conditions in the United States. especially after the Civil War. And there's also changes in ideas, changes in philosophy. So you have social changes and philosophic changes. Now, as for the social conditions, and this is something that you'll see when we get to the Woodrow Wilson readings, he talks about this. But one of the things that contributes to the rise of the progressive movement is the belief among a number of political actors that the life in the United States had changed, so significantly over the course of the 19th century that a lot of the principles or the elements of the founders' Constitution had simply become outmoded, right? As Wilson says in one of his speeches, the old political formulas do not fit the present problems. And so now the changes that they have in mind, I usually point out three of them. There's more to it than that, but I usually point out three of them. One of which is obviously the industrialization of the United States, that the 19th century is the story of the rise of industry in the United States. In the early 1800s, the United States was primarily made up of, farmers, people living on the land, working in the agricultural sector. And then, you had people in the cities and things like that. And a lot of them, though, were kind of, small business owners or independent artisans or the like. But, it was a old-fashioned economy where a lot of people worked in agriculture. And over the course of the 19th century, the United States economy shifts fairly decisively in the direction of industry in terms of, factory production and all of those kinds of things, giving rise to a new group of people that hadn't really existed before in the United States, and that's an industrial working class. So you have certain class tensions. This was actually alluded to somewhat in your John Calhoun readings. But so you have industrialization, the development of modern capitalism in the United States during this time. And alongside that, you have urbanization. That is a large proportion of the population of the United States moving to the cities from the countryside. And obviously these two things are related because industry is concentrated in the cities. And so people, kind of leave the proverbial farm in order to go work in a factory. And that urbanization was also fueled to a degree by the third big factor in the 19th century, which is immigration. You have some very large waves of immigration in the 19th century, giving rise to questions about assimilation and things like that, but also contributing to the size and the crowding of the American cities, right? So there are a lot of cities where, there's a sense that you have this huge bustling city full of these workers who maybe are not living under good conditions and, things like that, all the various social problems that go along with having a really large, crowded urban population, many of whom are poor. So you've got all of that going on in the late 19th century. And, so basically more people crowded into cities working in factories and things like that, and a relative decline of things such as independent farmers, independent artisans, small businessmen. I mean, obviously you still have a lot of those people, but you have a relative growth in the importance of large corporations whose wealth is based in, industry during this time. And this led to a concern that the United States government, as it was structured by the founders, was making it, deliberately or not, into an instrument of the wealthy few. There was a concern by the late 19th century that the United States was being transformed into an oligarchy. And so the 10 years ago, or not 10 years ago, but back during the time of Occupy Wall Street and all that, you sometimes would hear talk about the 1% and the 99%, the idea of the wealthy 1%, and then there's everybody else. And, in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a real concern that the United States government was primarily serving the interests of the wealthy 1%, so to speak, at the expense of everybody else. So you have social conditions that progressives thought there were problems with inequality, with the distribution of wealth, problems with people's independence, their life opportunities. They saw a lot of social problems develop over the course of the 19th century, and they did not believe that the federal government, as designed by the founders, could address these problems adequately. So they called for change. But then alongside those social conditions and those new social problems, as I said, there were also philosophical changes. And again, these begin in Europe. My previous lectures about Rousseau and Hegel are kind of getting into this. And this is a change in a way of thinking that basically, it's not simply that there are new social problems that the founders' political principles can't adequately address, but there was a serious critique of the founders' political principles as such, a belief that, the kind of Lockean political philosophy in the Declaration, and sort of indirectly in the Constitution was just a false political philosophy. It got human nature wrong, it got ethics wrong, and it does not properly understand the proper scope of government. So that's a philosophic change. You really, you saw that in Hegel, especially with Hegel talking about how you can't take your bearings by the state of nature. People are not free by nature. Freedom is a capacity that has to develop over time as civilization develops, that the state or government, it does not exist simply to protect people from harm and protect their property, that the state has positive goals of its own in promoting the common good, things like that. And those philosophic critiques of the founding obviously therefore predate industrialization, but you might say in a way that the various social and political and economic problems that industrialization sort of threw up in the nation over the course of the 1800s sort of gave added force to these critiques of the founding principles and a search for an alternative set of principles. And so what I'll talk about in the next two lectures is Charles Merriam's overview of how progressive political scientists, both why they rejected the founding principles, and then also, kind of brief outline of the alternative to the founding principles that they propose.